Ray, it's always good to have you on the program. Where we are right now seems to be kind of where we were a few months ago, which is back to fighting. Is that incorrect?
Well, you're going to see this sort of a cycle of war and peace often in this particular conflict because there's no ultimate resolution of this passage of waterways. What we saw with memorandum of understanding that was signed between the two powers, particularly provision 5, was subject to a lot of different interpretations. For the Iranians, that meant they were in control of the Gulf. For the Americans, that meant the free passage, and they could actually even have a privileged corridor where they would convoy ships. And that's what triggered the latest crisis. So long as there's some sort of a definitive arrangement for the Persian Gulf traffic, you're going to see this sort of a back and forth and patterns of escalation and potentially de-escalation.
Is Iran, though, by constantly the back and forth here with the United States, essentially going to move themselves to a point where they kind of lose their vantage point? In other words, we talked earlier about, pipelines as other ways and alternate
Jeff Karen
routes.
from Energy Group Capital saying that.
Yep, and alternate routes in terms of getting oil out of the Middle East. I mean, nobody wants to necessarily be beholden to Iran longer term. So this might be our reality today, but longer term, do we see alternative ways of getting oil out of the region and Iran loses the upper hand?
Well, that's going to be the case as all these countries are trying to look for a different way of transporting their oil and different way of dealing with international markets. However, those pipelines are still vulnerable to attack by aircraft, missiles, or drones. And wherever that oil is transported, it has to be in some kind of a harbor, and that harbor will also be vulnerable to potential Iranian attacks. So those particular facilities and so on will be more protected, but not necessarily invulnerable given the proximity of the geography in that region.
Ray, how long, look, nobody knows the answer to this, but I'm curious on your view of it. You said this is going to be sort of the natural, because of the waterway and the geography here, and this is where we are, there will be ebbs and flows when it comes to peace versus conflict. There are political pressures on the president when it comes to the election and oil prices and what has turned out to be a relatively unpopular war. I'm just curious about your view. Like, when are we going to stop calling up Ray Takeyh and talking to him about this?
Well, you should never stop calling me up. We can talk about other things. I like your previous segment actually about these vehicles, these taxi.
Hey, you know what? You were welcome anytime. When am I going to stop talking to you about this war? How's that?
Eventually, I think both parties are trying to inflict pain on each other. The Iranians are trying to destabilize the international markets and put pain on president with all the factors that you talked about. And of course, we're inflicting substantial amount of pain on the Iranians with the blockade and so forth. The question is not at this point who can inflict more pain, is who can endure more. And at this particular point, the Iranians seem to be signaling that they're capable of essentially continuing this conflict. I suspect there may be an off-ramp at some point. The Omanis are already trying to mediate. The Iranian foreign minister has been in contact with his aides, with his counterparts, and there may be some sort of a diplomatic off-ramp. But we're going to see this happening again until we accept the fact that Iran is going to charge tolls, or the U.S. Navy essentially reclaims the Gulf and patrols it for the foreseeable future with all the hazards that are involved in that activity.
Those are two outcomes that the U.S. does not want.
That's right. But, as Mark Twain used to say, it's easier to stay out than get out. So we are in this particular conflict, and the only way out is to concede to the toll system that the Iranians can have. We can call it something, the Persian Gulf Transit Authority or something, or the United States Navy gets in there in a measurable way and began the patrolling of the Gulf. And even then, it'll be subject to violent attacks by Iran, so fluctuations in the market and the insurance rates and so forth. The point that needs to be emphasized is the Gulf traffic is not going back to status quo ante. We're not going back to pre-February 28th. Where we are from here depends on the calculation of the entire set of actors who are engaged in this unpredictable attempt to inflict pain on one another.
What does that mean?
Escalatory patterns that can get out of hand.
Ray, what does it mean for a Middle East going forward? And I bring it up. The Bloomberg Big Take today it's entitled 1,000 Days of War and Upheaval That Reshaped the Middle East. And it just talks about what has emerged in its place as a region remade by more violence. Alliances have shifted, battlefields expanded beyond recognition, trade routes redrawn, and public opinion divided. I mean, how are you thinking about what the Middle East is, I guess, after this is all said and done?
Well, it'll be a different place. What the Iranians have demonstrated is that the notions of power and power projections are different in 21st century Middle East. You can actually inflict substantial damage on the United States and the global economy and your neighbors with rudimentary technology that are very difficult to disable with aerial bombing. And irrespective of disparity of power between the United States and Iran, which is quite considerable, this campaign has been effective. Second of all, I think the United States alliances in the region are rather frayed. Obviously, there are a lot of problems in Israeli-American alliance, but even in the Gulf, where there's a lack of confidence in the Americans, all these Gulf states, all these small Gulf states are coming to terms with Iran on their own. There are a lot of side deals being made every day.
Mm-hmm. Well, what's interesting is our Bloomberg economics team, found more polarization, more violence, shifting alliances. And what's interesting is they say Iran and Israel are the two countries with the most strained ties. Just got about 30 seconds here. Yeah. Where is Israel in all of this?
The Israelis are in a difficult situation, particularly in terms of their alliance with the United States that is frayed. That's going to be a long-term problem for Israel moving forward with all these calls for suspension of aid, if not termination for it. And Israelis have also learned that essentially bombing things is not necessarily a pathway to success in the region of this degree of volatility.